The research for this question asks, what factors affects birth rate in countries around the world? The data for this research comes from the country's aggregate dataset and the number of respondents. Birth rates play a substantial role in a country's growth. The Weintraub article says population growth and economic growth are interdependent. This is backed up by policies like the one-child policy in China or the pronatalistic policies adopted in countries in Europe. I will be testing the effects of societal factors such as poverty, life expectancy, and literacy rates have on birth rates. I will then create a dummy variable which will be region-specific, looking to see if being an African nation affects the relationship between my independent variable and birth rates. My dependent variable is annual birth rates per 1,000 people, and because it comes from an aggregate dataset, it is not indexed. My first independent variable is literacy rates. I hypothesize that as literacy rates increases in a country, the annual birth rates per 1,000 people will decrease. This is proven in Barrow's article, in which he states countries with higher human capital also have lower birth rates. A real-life example is given in Nair's article, where he refers to Kerala, in which birth rates declined due to an increase in education. My second independent variable is life expectancy. I hypothesize that as life expectancy at birth increases, the annual birth rate per 1,000 people will decrease. This is backed up by World Health Organization's report. My last independent variable will be poverty. I hypothesize that as poverty increases, annual birth rate per 1,000 people will also increase. I support this from stats from UNICEF's reports. I shall now create a correlation index using my independent variable and my 3 dependent variables. There are no missing values to declare. The cell entries in the table above are Pearson's correlation coefficients, and their statistical significances are indicated in the parentheses. As this is aggregate data, the R values for all 3 of my independent variables are either strongly or fairly strongly related to birth rate. The negative sign in front of life expectancy and literacy rate tells me that an increase in life expectancy and literacy rates would cause a decrease in birth rates. The 0.63 R value of poverty tells us that as poverty increases, so does birth rates per 1,000 people. These results are statistically significant because their p-values are all 0.00, which tell us that the results are not due to sampling error. I shall now examine the same relationship using multiple regression analysis and using my 3 independent variables to explain variation in my dependent variable. The b-values indicate the direction and the number of units of change in the dependent variable due to a single unit change in the independent variable. Therefore, a 1-unit rise in the life expectancy at birth will cause the annual births per 1,000 people to go down by 0.27 births. Moving down the column, a 1 percent point rise in a country's literacy rate produces a decrease of 0.26 annual births per 1,000 people. Lastly, a 1-unit rise in the percent of people below the poverty line will cause the annual birth rates to increase by 0.13 per 1,000 people. This is controlling for all the other 2 variables. The difference in these variables is reflected by the slightly larger standard error for life expectancy. The standardized beta scores also show the strong negative relationship between life expectancy and birth rate and literacy rate and birth rate, as well as the positive relationship between poverty and birth rate. Yet I felt like this analysis was very general, and so I had to ask, was region playing an unnoticed role? And so I created a dummy regional variable with categories labeled Others and Africa, where African countries received the score of 1. I hypothesize that literacy rates and life expectancy will cause replication when controlling for Africa. However, poverty will cause specification, as literature states that while there is a worldwide trend of a decline in poverty, it continues to rise in Africa. I then ran a cross-tabulation for birth rate and poverty, and then birth rate and poverty while controlling for Africa. The tau B for African countries falls just outside the control tabulation range, and so that partial relationship has become more significant, and we can say that we have specified the conditions under which the original relationship occurs. The chi-squared of 0.00 for both the relationships tell us that they are both statistically significant. I will now attempt to include interaction effects in a regression analysis with a subset of cases, as it is easier to interpret when specifying regionally. The first regression analysis, the one on the left, shows the effect of poverty on birth rate. The b-value tells us that a 1-unit rise in the percent of people below the poverty line will cause the annual birth rate to increase by 0.6 per 1,000. The second regression on the right shows the additive effect of poverty and region when controlling for Africa has on birth rate. We can see the b-value of 0.47 while controlling for Africa has declined. And By being marginally outside the range of 0.30 to 0.6 calculated by multiplying the standard error by 2, we can say that this is partial specification. All the b-values are significant as displayed by the asterisks. To summarize the findings, all three variables do a fairly good job at explaining variation in the dependent variable. In the first regressional analysis, the adjusted R-squared produced a 0.78, which is explained variance of approximately 78%. While correlation analysis indicated interrelationships between the independent variables, their tolerance scores all exceeded 0.20, which proved that there is no serious problem with multicollinearity. Both life expectancy and literacy rates have a strong negative relationship in both models. As they went up, birth rates went down, as hypothesized. As also hypothesized, poverty had a strong positive influence on birth rate in both models. Specification was observed for poverty when controlling for the region of Africa. To conclude, the most significant factor influencing high birth rates, specifically in the region of Africa, is poverty. Therefore, if birth rate is as important as literature claims it to be for a country's positive growth, African nations should consider the impact of poverty. Further research can be done through case studies. For example, Nigeria and the Iju experiment. So far, they have been successful in reducing poverty by creating jobs and harnessing social capital. Further research can be conducted to see if these models prove to have long-term sustainability. Can they be replicated? These are all things to consider when looking at poverty as a factor of high birth rates.